Hello everyone. Before we jump in, make sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's get started. I've always had this strange pull towards cemeteries at night. Most people find the thought uncomfortable, maybe even disturbing, but for me it's one of the few places where I feel a mix of quiet and intensity that's hard to explain. The rows of stones, the way the air hangs differently inside the gates, the silence that is never completely silent, it's like the whole atmosphere slows down. I started going when I was younger, sneaking into the little graveyard at the edge of town. Over time it became less about sneaking around and more about trying to capture the feeling of the place with my camera. At first, my friends thought I was weird for it, but I had a way of dragging them along. They'd roll their eyes, laugh about it, and complain until we were inside, but almost every time, by the end of the night, they admitted it wasn't so bad. Some even said they had fun, though I don't know if they meant it or just didn't want to admit they were scared. I usually brought my camera along. There's something about photography at night that's both frustrating and rewarding, especially in a cemetery. The headstones catch the light in strange ways. The angles come out sharper, the shadows longer. Sometimes I'd point the lens at a row of graves, and the autofocus would struggle, the little motor inside whirring back and forth without catching. There was one night in particular where no matter what I did, the camera wouldn't focus. When it finally did lock onto something, the shutter wouldn't close. I stood there pressing the button, listening to the mechanical click hang open like the whole thing had frozen. I thought it was just a technical glitch, but it went on the entire night. Later, when I looked at the shots I did manage to take, most of them were blurred or filled with these odd little spheres of light scattered across the frame. Orbs, people like to call them. Probably dust, moisture in the air, reflections from the streetlight across the road. But I'd be lying if I said part of me didn't want to believe it was something more. It wasn't just the pictures, though. The longer you spend walking through graves at night, the more you start to notice how much sound carries. A twig snapping feels louder. The wind brushing through the trees above your head feels closer, almost like something moving along behind you. That's probably why what happened with one of my friends stuck with me so much. There was a group of us that night, 5 or 6 maybe. We parked a little ways down the road, so no one would notice the car. The cemetery itself sat behind a wrought iron fence, parts of it bent from years of weather and rust, and the gate squeaked when we pushed it open. I remember the crunch of gravel under our shoes as we stepped inside, the way the air felt heavier, like the night was thicker once we crossed the boundary. I was already pulling out my camera, aiming it at the older section where the stones leaned and tilted as if they were struggling to hold themselves upright. My friends hung back, whispering and joking like they always did, but one of them stopped. Not just slowed down, not just hesitated, he froze. I looked back and saw him standing there, stiff, staring into the dark between the rows. The others noticed too and tried to brush him off, telling him to keep moving, but he wouldn't. He shook his head, turned around, and said he was heading back to the car. That was unusual for him. He wasn't the type to spook easily. We let him go, figuring he'd sit it out, but when we eventually returned, he was pale, almost shaky. He swore up and down that while we were walking, he heard footsteps behind us. Not just once or twice, consistent, like someone was following the group, keeping pace. And then he said he heard crying, a woman's voice, faint at first but growing clearer. That was enough to make him turn back. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there with us, just out of sight. The thing about stories like that is they stick with you even if you don't want them to. At the time, I laughed it off and told him he probably heard the wind in the trees, or an echo of our own footsteps bouncing around the rows. Cemeteries are deceptive like that. Sound doesn't behave normally in open fields and places with stones everywhere. But I couldn't stop replaying the image of him frozen on the gravel, looking so certain that something was right there behind us. The truth is, even if nothing supernatural is happening, cemeteries at night are still unsettling. They're quiet, but it's the kind of quiet where you notice every small thing. A branch cracks under its own weight, and it sounds like someone's stepping on it. The wind shifts, and it feels like someone's breath against the back of your neck. Sometimes it's so dark that your eyes trick you into thinking something's moving between the stones, just out of your line of sight. And then there's the simple fact that you're standing in the middle of hundreds of graves. You can't help but feel the weight of that, even if you tell yourself it doesn't matter. The longer I kept up these night trips, the more little things piled up. Batteries draining faster than they should, camera settings changing on their own, strange distortions in photos. Again, all of it could be explained away by equipment failure, cold air, human error. But when it's past midnight, your only light is a dim flashlight beam, and you're standing among the dead, those explanations don't feel as convincing. There was one night I stayed later than I should have. My friends had already left, bored and tired of waiting, while I messed around with long exposures and different angles. I told them I'd be fine walking back to the car on my own. The cemetery was quiet, just the sound of leaves shifting above me and the distant hum of a car passing on the main road. I crouched down to frame a shot of a broken headstone with ivy crawling up its side, but the camera refused to cooperate. The shutter locked open again, leaving me stuck staring through the viewfinder at nothing but blur. I lowered it, annoyed, and that's when I realized how still everything had gotten. I didn't hear the trees anymore. No wind, no leaves. Just silence. And then faint, behind me, the crunch of gravel. Slow, steady, like someone walking at the same careful pace I had taken earlier. I froze, listening, every nerve in my body tensed. The sound stopped when I did. I turned, shining my light across the rows, but there was nothing there. Just tilted stones, shadows stretching across the grass, and the pale glow of marble markers catching the beam. I told myself it was an animal. A raccoon, maybe. A stray dog. But as I walked toward the gate, I heard it again. Not close, not rushing, but steady, crunch, pause, crunch, as if matching me step for step, never gaining, never falling behind. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and kept walking, faster now, heart thudding in my chest. By the time I reached the road, the sound had stopped. I looked back once before getting into the car, and the cemetery looked exactly as it always did. Still, quiet, empty. That's the thing about nights like those. There's always a rational explanation, if you want one badly enough. The camera malfunctions were just bad luck, the orbs just dust, the crying just wind twisting through the trees. But when you're there in the middle of it, explanations don't matter. What matters is the way your stomach knots up when the air goes still, or the way your chest tightens when you hear footsteps that don't belong to you. I still go to cemeteries at night. I still take my camera and try to catch something worth keeping. But every time I do, I think back to those nights. The stuck shutter, the orbs, my friend refusing to go any farther, the sound of gravel shifting behind me. Whether it's all coincidence or not, I can't shake the way it felt in those moments. Real or not, those feelings are enough to make you understand why people are afraid of the dark, and why places meant for silence carry a kind of weight you can't find anywhere else. That's why I keep going back. Not because I want proof of something, not because I expect to capture anything unusual on my camera, but because that uneasy edge makes me feel more alive than anywhere else. Every creak of the gate, every whisper of wind between the stones, every echo of a step that might or might not be mine, it all reminds me of what it's like to stand somewhere that forces you to pay attention. And maybe that's all it ever was, nothing more than silence, shadows, and the tricks of my own mind. But sometimes, when I'm walking out alone, the crunch of gravel trailing just behind me feels too steady, too human to ignore. When my son was little, we lived in a small apartment complex that sat right next to a long walking path. The path was one of those simple paved trails that cut through the edge of the neighborhood and stretched for miles. On one side of it, there was a cluster of woods that stayed dark and quiet even in the summer. On the other side, if you followed it far enough, it wound around to an old cemetery. The cemetery wasn't huge, but it had been there for decades, with rows of stones tilted slightly from age, and a few big oaks that stretched their roots right up through the grass. We had a routine. Every night, after dinner, I'd bundle my son into the stroller, and we would head out for a walk. He was just shy of 3 years old at the time, still so little that everything we did felt like part of teaching him how the world worked. He didn't know what the cemetery was, didn't ask questions about the stones or the gates. To him, it was just another part of the walk, something we passed every single evening as the sun went down. Sometimes I would point out squirrels, or he would laugh at a dog passing by with its owner, and those were the kinds of simple things that made our nights feel safe and predictable. There had never been a single issue, not once. If anything, the walk was a way to calm him before bedtime. He would usually lean back in the stroller, hands folded across the little blanket I tucked around him, and watch everything pass by as I pushed us along. It was one of those things that felt so ordinary, you never really think about it until something shakes it up. And one night, that's exactly what happened. We had left the apartment around the same time we always did. The air was cooler than usual, and I remember noticing how quickly the light was fading. By the time we reached the section of the trail that cut alongside the cemetery, the lamps on the path had already clicked on, those dim yellow ones that never light up as much ground as you want them to. I wasn't uneasy. It was just another evening. I pushed the stroller, listened to the crunch of the gravel near the paved section, and kept my head down the way you do when you're lost in your own thoughts. Then I felt the stroller jerk slightly, not from me but from him. I looked down and saw his whole body tensing up, his little hands clutching the blanket tighter than usual. His face had gone pale, and before I could even ask what was wrong, he started crying, loud, sharp cries that didn't sound like the kind he gave when he was tired or cranky. This was different. He was terrified. His chest heaved, and tears rolled down his cheeks almost instantly. He twisted in the stroller, trying to push himself backward as if he wanted out of the place altogether. I bent down, tried to calm him, but he was beyond reason. His voice cracked as he screamed, and though I couldn't make out every word, the thing he repeated over and over was that we had to leave, that we couldn't be there, that something didn't want us there. It was so strange because he didn't even understand what a cemetery was. He had no concept of it, and yet here he was, reacting as if he knew something I didn't. The way he clung to the stroller, the way his eyes darted wildly, it was like he saw people crowding around us, even though I couldn't see a single soul. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't stop to question it. Instinct took over, and I grabbed the handles of the stroller and ran. My feet pounded the path, the wheels rattled against the uneven pavement, and his cries carried over the silence of the night. I didn't look around, didn't check behind me. All I knew was that my little boy was hysterical, and that was enough to convince me we had to get out of there. Once we cleared the edge of the cemetery and got back to the regular stretch of the walking trail, I slowed just enough to catch my breath. My chest burned, my arms ached from gripping the stroller so tightly, and my ears buzzed with the leftover echo of his screaming. Slowly, he started to calm down too, though his breathing still came in short, shaky bursts. I leaned over him, wiped his tears with my sleeve, and whispered that it was okay, that we were almost home. He didn't say much, just clutched my arm with his small hand, like he needed proof I was really there. That was when I noticed something strange. Up ahead, there was a set of headlights cutting through the trees. For a second, I couldn't figure out what I was looking at because this path wasn't meant for vehicles. There was no road that led here, no reason for a car to be creeping slowly down the walking trail. But sure enough, as the lights grew closer, I saw the outline of a police car rolling along at a crawl, its tires bumping gently over the uneven surface. It pulled up alongside us, and the window rolled down. The officer inside leaned over, scanning the path, scanning me, scanning my son. His expression was serious, not casual. He didn't look like someone just out on a drive. He looked like someone searching for something. He asked if I had seen anyone out there. I shook my head quickly, said no. My voice sounded shaky even to me, but I meant it. Aside from us, the trail had been empty. That's when he told me they were looking for someone. He didn't give details, didn't say who or why, only that the person could be dangerous and that we needed to get home right away. I turned my head and saw the faint outline of our apartment building just down the slope, the lit windows a reminder that safety was right there within reach. The officer said he would watch us until we were inside. And he did. I pushed the stroller down the path, my legs moving stiffly now, the adrenaline fading into a heavy weight in my stomach. My son stayed silent, his eyes wide, his little fists balled tight against his lap. Every step I took, I felt the officer's headlights following, the car crawling behind us like a shadow until we reached the edge of the lot where the trail met the apartments. I unlocked the front door with trembling hands and pushed us inside. When I turned back, the patrol car was still there, engine humming softly, headlights spilling across the pavement. The officer gave one last nod, then rolled away down the trail, leaving us standing in the quiet of our apartment. The relief didn't come right away. I shut the door, locked it, then checked the windows twice. My son clung to me as I carried him to his room, tucking him into bed even though his eyes stayed open long after I turned off the light. I lay awake that night too, listening for sounds outside, every creak of the building making my chest tighten. The more I thought about it, the more the whole thing unsettled me. The way my son had reacted out of nowhere, the way he had screamed that we had to leave. He didn't know there was someone dangerous nearby. He couldn't have. But something inside him, something so raw and insistent, had made him panic right there at the cemetery. It was like he knew, in his own way, that staying would have been a mistake. I never forgot that night. For weeks afterward, I changed our routine. We walked earlier, before dark, and I avoided the cemetery completely. I never found out who the police had been looking for or what exactly had happened out there. Maybe it was someone passing through, maybe worse. All I know is that something about that evening shook me in a way that stuck. Looking back, I can say this: my son's terror pushed me to run, and running got us out of the cemetery at the exact moment we needed to leave. Whether it was coincidence or instinct or something I'll never understand, it kept us safe. And when I think about how easily it could have gone differently, how easily we could have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, I feel a chill that has never really left me. That was the night a simple nightly walk stopped being routine. That was the night I realized how quickly ordinary can turn into danger, and how sometimes the warning you get doesn't make sense until much later. I trusted his fear, and because of that, we made it home. And that's the only ending that matters. When I was 8 years old, my mother had a habit of taking me with her whenever she went to the cemetery to visit my great-grandfather. She didn't like going alone, and since I was still a kid, she always kept me close. At that age, the cemetery wasn't as frightening to me as you might expect. It wasn't like the ones in movies with heavy fog and broken headstones everywhere. It was more like a quiet, wide-open park, with rows of stones lined neatly in the grass, trees spaced out here and there, and long gravel paths that crunched under our shoes. The air there always felt still, even when the wind moved through the branches. My mother usually brought flowers, sometimes roses, and other times simple wildflowers she picked up from a small shop nearby. She would kneel down in front of the grave, brush away the dirt and dried leaves from the stone, and place the flowers gently against it. She often stood there silently, lips moving a little like she was praying, but she never said much to me during those visits. She seemed to go into her own quiet world when she was there. I didn't really understand death yet, not in the way adults do. I just thought of the cemetery as a place full of names and dates carved into stone, and while my mom was busy, I would wander around a little. I never went too far because she told me not to, but I did walk between the rows, reading names I couldn't always pronounce, looking at the shapes of the stones, some tall, some small, some with angels or crosses. It was strange but also kind of interesting, like looking at a giant outdoor library where every stone told you who used to live and when they were gone. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that I first noticed the girl. She looked about my age, maybe a little older. I remember she had a calm expression, the kind of face that didn't seem too excited or too sad, just steady. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore a simple dress, nothing unusual. At first, I didn't think too much of it. Sometimes other families came to visit their relatives, so I thought she was just another kid brought along like me. The thing was, she didn't act shy like most kids did when they saw someone they didn't know. She stayed near the same area every time I saw her, almost like she was waiting. And after a while, I started seeing her more often, like it wasn't just a coincidence. I remember standing near a row of headstones while my mom was busy arranging flowers, and I would notice the girl a few rows away, looking at me, not in a creepy way, but like she was curious. Eventually, we started spending time together there. Since I was just a kid, I didn't think too hard about it. She was just someone to be around while my mom was caught up in her own thoughts. I would sit near the grass, fiddling with little pebbles, and she would sit nearby too. Sometimes we pointed out different headstones or trees, little things to keep our eyes busy. I found myself looking for her every time we came back, and most of the time, she was there. My mother noticed her too. Once, she even asked me who I was playing with. I told her it was the girl I saw often there, and she just nodded. She didn't seem concerned. I think she thought it was nice that I wasn't bored out of my mind while she visited my great-grandfather's grave. My mom never really questioned it beyond that, and I didn't have the kind of mind at that age to wonder why the girl was always around, why she didn't seem to leave like the other families. It became almost a routine. My mom would bring flowers, I would wait for the girl, and the two of us would spend the visit together. We didn't run or play loudly, because the place never felt right for that. It was more about being side by side, passing the time, exploring little corners of the cemetery that weren't too far from where my mom could see me. I felt comfortable with her, like she belonged there in a way I didn't question. After a while, though, things started to change in a small way. The girl seemed to want me to follow her more. Instead of just sitting nearby, she would walk a little further off the main path, looking back at me like she wanted me to come along. She never forced me, but she gave this kind of expectant look, like she thought it was natural I should go with her. At first, I didn't. My mom always told me not to wander too far, and something inside me felt nervous about stepping beyond the spots I already knew. But the girl kept hinting at it every time we were there. She would stand in one place, glance at me, then glance further down the row, like she was trying to say, "Come see this." I can still picture her standing with her hands clasped, her expression calm but patient, as though she knew eventually I would give in. I didn't tell my mom about it. I guess I didn't think she would understand. It felt like something just between the girl and me. One day, though, I finally gave in. It wasn't a special day, nothing about it stood out. My mom was kneeling at the grave like usual, the sun was warm on the grass, and the girl gave me that same look again, that quiet, steady look that seemed to be waiting. I hesitated, but then I slowly walked after her. She led me past a few more rows, not too far, but far enough that I had to glance back to see if my mom could still spot me. The girl kept walking until she stopped in front of a grave. It was an older-looking one, the stone weathered, edges a little worn down. There were no fresh flowers there, just some dried-up ones crumbling against the base. The girl stood very still, looking at the stone. Then she turned slightly, as if to show me. I looked at it the way a kid does, not really understanding the name or the years carved into it, just seeing the stone itself. But what unsettled me wasn't the grave itself, it was the way she stood in front of it, so firmly, so calmly, almost like she belonged to it. I felt a strange chill crawl up my back. I couldn't explain it then, but it felt wrong, like I was standing somewhere I wasn't supposed to. The girl didn't move closer to me, she didn't say anything, but the way she lingered there, looking at that grave as if it were something more than stone, made me uneasy. That's when it hit me. To her, that grave wasn't just a marker in the ground. She was treating it like a house, like a place she lived. She seemed to be showing it to me the way a kid shows their bedroom to a friend. The thought unsettled me so deeply I froze for a moment. I didn't stay long. My stomach felt tight, and a rush of fear hit me that I couldn't put into words. Without saying anything, I turned around and hurried back to where my mom was. She was still at my great-grandfather's grave, fixing the flowers, and when I got there, I stayed close to her side, holding onto her arm. I didn't even look back. After that day, the girl was gone. Every time we returned to the cemetery, I half expected her to appear again, waiting at the edge of the rows like always. But she never did. No matter how many times we went back, I never saw her again. As I grew older, I thought about it more. At the time, I was just a kid who had been unsettled by something I couldn't fully grasp. But now, when I look back, I understand the weight of it better. Cemeteries can feel quiet and peaceful, but they also hold a heavy presence of all the lives that came before. Kids can sometimes blur the line between imagination and reality, and I know how easy it is to let your mind shape things in strange ways. But whether that girl was simply another child I happened to meet, or whether my own young mind filled in gaps with something else, the fact remains that she led me to a grave and stood there as though it was her home. That's something I'll never forget. I stopped wandering the rows after that. Whenever I went with my mom, I stayed near her, quiet and still, waiting until she was ready to leave. I never told her what happened, not really. It felt like something I should carry myself. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and see the image clearly. That small figure standing in front of a weathered stone, calm and patient, as if she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And me, just a child, realizing in one sharp moment that I wanted no part of it. That was the last time I saw her, and I've never forgotten it. I've been drawn to the paranormal for as long as I can remember. Even as a kid, while other kids were out riding bikes or playing video games, I found myself pulled toward places people said were haunted or strange. I didn't think of it as chasing ghosts back then, more like chasing a feeling. I liked that quiet, heavy air in places most people avoided. One of the first places I really got attached to was a small cemetery in rural Illinois. It wasn't far from where I grew up, maybe a 15-minute drive down a two-lane road lined with cornfields. There weren't a lot of houses nearby, just scattered farms with barns and silos standing against the horizon. At night, it felt like the middle of nowhere. The cemetery itself wasn't huge, maybe an acre or two at most, surrounded by a rusting fence that leaned in spots, with a single gate that barely closed. Some of the graves dated back to the 1800s, their stones worn and tilting, while others were recent with fresh flowers still resting against them. A big oak tree stood near the center, its branches reaching wide like an umbrella, dropping leaves in the fall that covered the ground so thick you could barely see where you were walking. I started going out there when I was still in grade school. My mom thought it was weird, my dad didn't really care, and my younger brother just tagged along sometimes because he didn't want to miss out. I had this cheap little point-and-shoot camera, the kind with a grainy flash, and I'd take pictures at night, hoping to catch something unusual. Over time, I did catch a few things, nothing dramatic, but sometimes when I looked back at the pictures there'd be orbs floating in the air or a faint mist curling where there hadn't been any fog. It was enough to keep me going back. By the time I was in early college, I had a whole folder of photos, maybe a couple hundred. Some were just normal night shots of gravestones and trees, but every so often there was one that stood out. My friends didn't think much of it, but I knew what I saw. The experience that has stayed with me the most happened when I was about 12, one of the earlier times I went with my dad and my brother. It was a cool, clear night. I remember the sky was packed with stars, the kind of sky you only get out in the country where the streetlights don't drown them out. We walked around the cemetery for about an hour, taking pictures and whispering even though there was no one to disturb. It was quiet, the only sounds coming from crickets and the wind moving through the corn. Nothing felt strange while we were there. If anything, it felt peaceful. When we got back home, my dad put his SD card into the computer to see what he'd captured. Most of the photos were just dark shapes, stones, and trees. But then he clicked on one, and there it was, a faint, smoky mist curling right over one of the graves. It looked like someone had held a lit cigarette just under the lens, the kind of thin, white smoke that twists and bends. It wasn't foggy out, and none of us smoked. It was just there, hanging in the frame. We were all leaning close to the monitor when our dog started barking at the window right next to us. At first, we ignored it. He barked a lot at squirrels, raccoons, whatever might be outside at night. But he didn't stop. He barked and barked, a sharp, consistent sound that went on for 20 minutes straight. The timing was what got to us. He hadn't made a sound all night until we saw that picture. Finally, we went outside to see what he was barking at. The night was calm, the yard empty. No animals darting across the grass. No shadows moving along the fence line. Just silence, except for his low growl when he stood by the window. After a while, we gave up and went back inside. By then, I was tired. I went to my room, shut off the light, and crawled into bed. I slept in total darkness back then, the only light in the room being the red numbers of my digital alarm clock. I must have drifted off pretty quick because the next thing I knew, my eyes snapped open, and the clock read exactly 3 a.m. The room was still pitch black, but over the silence I heard this faint sound. It wasn't loud, more like a whisper of movement. A sliding sound, smooth, steady, like wood gliding across carpet. I was half asleep, my brain foggy, and I didn't think much of it at the time. I just lay there, eyes open, not moving. Then, without really processing what I'd heard, I closed my eyes again and drifted back off. When morning came, I got up and saw something that made my stomach drop. My desk sat in the corner near the door, and the wooden chair that I always kept pushed in was pulled out and turned. It was facing my bed. Perfectly. That chair was important. My room wasn't big, and the desk was right next to the door. If the chair wasn't pushed in, I couldn't get out without moving it. So I never left it out. Ever. And now it wasn't just pulled away from the desk. It was rotated directly toward me, like someone had sat there in the night and watched me sleep. I remember standing frozen in the doorway, just staring at it. I tried to tell myself maybe I had moved it before bed and forgot, but I knew I hadn't. I knew the way I kept my room, especially that chair. That was the moment everything shifted for me. Up until then, going to the cemetery had felt like a harmless adventure, something exciting to do with a camera. But now it felt different. It felt like something had followed me home. From that night on, I started taking precautions. Whenever I left a cemetery or any other place I poked around, I made it a point to say out loud that nothing was allowed to follow me. I didn't shout it, just said it in a firm voice, almost like closing a door behind me. It sounds silly, I know, but after that night with the chair, I wasn't willing to risk it again. Even with that routine, strange things still happened in my room for about a year. It wasn't every night, but often enough that I noticed. Sometimes I'd be sitting at my desk doing homework, and I'd get the sudden, clear sense that someone was standing behind me. Not just the usual feeling of being watched, but an actual weight in the air, the way the room feels when someone else is there even if you're not looking at them. I'd spin around, and of course, nothing was there. Other times it happened at night. I'd be lying in bed, wide awake, and I'd feel the mattress dip at the foot like someone had just sat down. No sound, no movement after that, just the pressure on the bed. I'd lie there frozen, holding my breath, waiting for it to pass. After a while, I got tired of being scared in my own room. I remember one night lying there and thinking, if something really is here, I can't live like this anymore. So I made a sort of deal in my head. I thought, if it has to stay, then fine, but only when I'm gone. The room is mine when I'm home, and whatever it is can have it when I'm away. That was the bargain I made silently, lying in the dark. And strangely enough, after that, things calmed down. I didn't feel the presence anymore, or at least not in the same way. The chair stayed where I left it. The bed never dipped again. My room felt like mine again. Looking back now, I was just 12 years old at the time, so maybe my mind was filling in the gaps. Maybe I was half asleep and imagined the chair moving, or maybe I left it out without remembering. Maybe the weight on the bed was just me shifting in my sleep. There are logical ways to explain all of it if I want to. But the feeling of it, the timing, the way it all lined up, it never left me. That experience changed how I approached the paranormal. I still went to cemeteries, still took pictures, still chased that strange, heavy air. But I did it with more respect. I didn't just wander in and out like it was a playground. I treated it like I was a guest in someone else's space. And whether it was just in my head or not, that approach seemed to work. It's been years since then, and I've had other strange moments, but none that shook me the way that chair did. That one simple detail, waking up to find it turned toward my bed, has stayed with me all this time. I can close my eyes and see it even now, as clear as the day it happened. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. But I'll tell you this, I never leave a place like that without making sure I say out loud that nothing is welcome to follow me home. And since I started doing that, my nights have been quiet. I guess the truth is, it doesn't matter if it was real or not. What matters is how it made me feel, and how it changed the way I look at the world. Some experiences stick with you, whether you can explain them or not. And that one has stuck with me, all these years later. I've always had an interest in cemeteries, though not in the way most people would think. I wasn't into anything dark or supernatural, and I wasn't one of those people who hung around graveyards at night to spook themselves. For me, it was something quieter, something grounded in real life. I liked documenting gravestones, photographing them, and uploading them to the Find a Grave site. It felt like a way of preserving history, of helping families who might be searching for their ancestors, and of giving names that had been fading into the weather a little more time to be remembered. It was something I did as a hobby, and over the years I'd visited dozens of cemeteries, small ones behind country churches, big sprawling city cemeteries with paved roads, and tiny family plots on the edges of fields where the stones were so old and worn you could barely make out the names. I never thought much about being afraid. Cemeteries didn't strike me as scary places. They were quiet, yes, but I usually went in the daytime, sometimes in the late afternoon, when the sun made the headstones cast long shadows across the grass. Most of the time it was peaceful, the only sounds being birds, wind through the trees, or the occasional car on a road nearby. But there were a few times that stood out, times when something about the experience got under my skin in a way I couldn't explain. The first time was with a friend of mine. We had gone out to a local cemetery not far from town. It wasn't a very large place, but it had been there for over 100 years. A lot of the names were German or Irish, families who had settled the area back in the 1800s. The place was laid out in neat rows, the older stones leaning and cracked, some broken clean in half, while newer ones stood polished and sharp-edged, decorated with flowers and little flags. It was a hot day, one of those sticky summer afternoons where the sun sits heavy on your shoulders and the air barely moves. I remember the sweat running down the back of my neck as we walked through the rows, me with my camera in one hand and a notebook in the other. I also knew that my ex's family had some people buried there. I couldn't remember exactly where their plot was, but I thought it might be interesting to come across it. I wasn't looking very hard, just walking and photographing stones, bending down to brush away leaves or dirt so I could get a clearer shot. At one point I stopped to show my friend something, an especially old stone with an inscription that had worn down almost smooth. As I was standing there, I suddenly felt it. A chill, so sudden and sharp that it made the sweat on my arms feel like it turned to ice. My whole body prickled, goosebumps racing across my skin like I'd stepped straight into a freezer. It wasn't just a faint shiver either. It was a physical shock, like someone had opened a door to a walk-in cooler right in front of me. I remember holding my arms out, showing my friend the raised bumps, the hair standing straight up, and laughing nervously about it. But then I looked down. Right at my feet, only a couple of steps away, was a large, polished stone. The family name carved into it was the one I'd been half searching for all afternoon. My ex's family. The one I hadn't been able to recall the exact location of. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, the goosebumps not fading, even though the sun was still beating down on us. My friend asked if I wanted a picture with it, but I shook my head and just bent down to photograph it the way I did all the others. I tried to focus on that, just the work of it, the click of the camera, the framing of the shot, but the feeling stayed with me. I walked away from that spot faster than I usually would have. It was strange, the timing of it all. I could tell myself it was just coincidence, just me walking until I happened to come across the name I was half expecting to see somewhere anyway. But I couldn't explain the cold that had run through me just seconds before, on a day when the air felt like it was baking. I didn't talk about that much afterward. It wasn't like anything had really happened. No shadows moving, no whispering voices, nothing dramatic. Just goosebumps and timing. But it stayed in the back of my mind, like a note I couldn't quite forget. The second experience, though, was harder to shake. That one happened on my own, in another cemetery maybe 20 miles away. This place was different, bigger, more spread out, with sections that sloped gently downhill toward a line of trees at the far edge. I'd gone there early in the morning, when the sun was still low and the grass was damp with dew. It was quiet, hardly any cars on the road, and the whole place had that hushed, heavy feel you sometimes get at dawn. I moved slowly through the rows, taking pictures, kneeling to get better angles. At one point I came to a small headstone. It wasn't like the tall marble markers or the wide family plots. It was just a small stone, clean but plain, with a name and dates that didn't stretch far at all. An infant. Only a few months between birth and death. I crouched down in front of it, camera in hand. I remember brushing away some grass that had grown up around the base, then leaning closer to focus on the lettering. And that's when it hit me. It was so sudden that I almost fell forward. A stabbing pain, sharp and blinding, like someone had driven a spike straight through the top of my skull. My vision blurred, and for a few seconds all I could do was hold myself up with one hand in the grass, my camera hanging useless from the other. The pain only lasted a few seconds, but it was the kind that leaves an echo in your body afterward. By the time it faded, I was left with a dull, throbbing headache that spread across the whole top of my head. I sat back on the grass, blinking, breathing hard. The world seemed too bright, the sunlight too sharp on the stones. I rubbed my temples, waiting for it to pass, but it didn't. The pain stuck with me the rest of the morning, into the afternoon, dragging at me like I hadn't slept in days. I did take the picture. I don't know why. It felt important to finish what I'd started. The photo came out clear, the little stone centered in the frame, the grass neat around it. I've looked at it since then wondering if maybe the baby had died from some kind of head trauma, if somehow that moment of blinding pain was a reflection of that. I don't know. I can't know. But it was hard not to think about. When I left that cemetery, the headache followed me home. I took some painkillers, laid down in a dark room, and eventually slept. By the next morning it was mostly gone, just a faint ache at the back of my skull like a bruise. But the memory of it stayed. Both of those experiences were simple, really. No shadows darting between stones, no voices in the air, no shapes in the distance. Just physical feelings, sharp and undeniable, that lined up with the moments in ways I couldn't easily explain. Maybe there are explanations: heat stroke, sudden blood pressure changes, tension headaches triggered by kneeling down too fast. I've thought of all of that. I still think of it, but what I can't shake is how specific it felt. How the cold came only when I stood at the grave I hadn't been able to find, on a day when the air was sweltering. How the stabbing pain came only when I leaned close to the small stone of a baby who hadn't lived more than a season. How both times the feelings were so strong they demanded to be noticed, so strong that I couldn't pretend they were nothing. I still go to cemeteries. I still take pictures and upload them. I still kneel in the grass and brush dirt off names and dates that haven't been touched in years. But I pay more attention now. I notice the air, the weight of it, the way my body feels as I move from stone to stone. I don't look for signs, but I don't ignore them anymore either. Because whatever happened to me on those days, whether it was just coincidence or something deeper, it reminded me that cemeteries aren't just quiet green spaces filled with stone markers. They are full of lives that ended, stories that stopped, people who once walked and breathed and spoke, but no longer do. And whether or not there's anything more to it than that, standing among them, you feel it. That weight, that presence of history, of loss, of something larger than yourself. And sometimes, if you're not expecting it, it presses closer than you'd think. I was goth as a teenager, and like most kids who leaned into that side of themselves, I spent a lot of time hanging around cemeteries. In my town there were two old ones that we gravitated to more than anywhere else. They weren't the polished, well-manicured type of cemeteries you see in movies, with bright flowers and fresh paint. These had been around for more than 100 years, and you could tell. The stones were worn down, names and dates faded almost to nothing, and in some places the earth had shifted so much that the headstones leaned, or looked like they might collapse any second. To us, back then, that was perfect. The decay and history fit the way we dressed, the way we thought, the way we wanted to be seen. And honestly, it gave us a place to go at night where no one would bother us. One of them had this legend, something every kid in town heard at some point. Supposedly, if you stood at this particular crossroad in the cemetery at night, you would see a ghostly hearse drive by. It would roll past without horses, without a driver, just floating. I never believed it. None of us did, really, but the idea of testing it out was too good to pass up. Teenagers like us lived for stuff like that. It gave the night some edge, a little thrill beyond just sitting around smoking or playing music too loud in someone's car. There was one night in particular that has stuck with me more than the rest. We were at the cemetery with the ghost hearse legend, the one with the crossroad. It was me and two friends. We didn't bring much, just a couple of cheap lighters, cigarettes, and one of those old gas station energy drinks that tasted like medicine. We had no flashlight beyond the weak yellow beam of a flip phone screen, but we knew the place well enough to walk it in the dark. The air was cool, one of those nights where the dampness sinks into your clothes and makes you feel like your skin is cold even when the air itself isn't freezing. The grass was wet, and our boots left tracks through it. Some parts of the cemetery had old cement crypts above ground, the kind with heavy stone lids, carved edges, names etched into the front. They looked more like short rectangular vaults than graves. Most of them were cracked or weather-stained, like they had been sitting there forgotten for decades. We didn't see a hearse that night, no surprise there. But what happened was far stranger, and in a way, more believable because of it. We were standing not far from one of those cement crypts when we heard it. At first I thought I imagined it, but the others froze too, which told me it was real. A voice. Singing. It was faint, but it carried in that eerie way sound does at night. And it wasn't just random humming or chanting. It was singing an actual song. Great balls of fire. No music behind it, just a man's voice, echoing like it was inside one of those cement vaults. I could hear the echo bouncing in my head even now. The voice didn't waver, didn't stumble over lyrics. It was clear, steady, and it came from inside one of those crypts. Every hair on my body stood up. We didn't move for a long moment, just listening. I could feel my stomach twist, because the logical part of me kept trying to come up with an explanation, but nothing made sense. There weren't any houses near the cemetery. The road was far enough away that even if someone had a radio on, it wouldn't sound like this. And besides, there was no music, just the voice. Eventually, the singing stopped. Just like that, cut off in the middle of a line. The silence afterward was worse than the singing itself. None of us said anything. We didn't need to. We just left. We didn't even try to look for the exact crypt it came from. I think some part of me didn't want to know. That night stuck with me for years because it wasn't supernatural in a dramatic way. It was unsettling because it was real sound, real singing, but coming from somewhere impossible. That wasn't the only strange thing that ever happened in those cemeteries. The other memory that has never left me came from the old VA cemetery. That one felt different. The layout was simple, with rows of white or gray stones, some small, some taller. Most of the graves dated back to the early 1900s, a few even earlier. Walking through there at night felt heavier than the other cemetery. Maybe it was knowing how many soldiers were buried there, or maybe it was just the endless rows of stones, each one reminding you that someone's life ended before yours began. One night we were walking through it. It wasn't a wild night, just us wandering, looking at the old graves, reading the names we could still make out. There was a quietness there that wasn't just about the lack of sound. It was the kind of quiet where you can hear your own breathing louder than usual. The moonlight was bright enough to cast long shadows across the rows of stones. That's when we saw it. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but then I realized it had shape, and it was moving. Behind one of the larger headstones, crouched low, was something dark. Not a person in black clothes, not just a trick of the eyes. It had texture, like it was covered in hair. It wasn't small either. It crouched, but even then it was big enough to look unnatural next to the stone. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. It didn't jump at us. It didn't make a sound, but the sight of it was enough. I don't think I've ever run as fast as I did in that moment. My friend was right there with me, and I swear if anyone had seen us, it would have been ridiculous. Two goth kids in black boots and eyeliner sprinting out of a graveyard like their lives depended on it. The sound of our boots hitting the ground, the air tearing in and out of my lungs, the blood rushing in my ears, it all blurred together into one desperate push to get out. We didn't look back until we were outside the gate and halfway down the street. When we finally slowed down, gasping and bent over, we didn't even talk about it. Neither of us wanted to try to explain what we saw. We both knew what we saw, and that was enough. Looking back now, years later, I can piece it together more calmly than I could back then. I don't think what we heard singing in the first cemetery was a ghost. The way the sound echoed, the way it carried, I think there must have been someone, maybe a homeless man, maybe a drifter, hiding or even living in one of those old crypts. People do it. They find shelter where they can. It makes sense, even if at the time it felt like something impossible. And the thing we saw in the VA cemetery, if I'm honest, it probably wasn't supernatural either. It could have been a large animal. A black bear, maybe, though I don't know why one would be there, crouched so still. Or maybe it was someone hunched over, a man in heavy clothing or with long hair. When you're young, when you're wired with fear and adrenaline, your brain fills in the blanks with whatever will scare you most. But none of that changes what I felt in the moment. The sound of that singing still makes my skin crawl when I think of it. The sight of that dark crouching shape is burned into my memory. We didn't find ghosts. We didn't uncover some legend come to life. What we found was worse in a way. Proof that even when things can be explained, when they're real, they can still scare you enough to make you run for your life. Those nights were a long time ago, but they changed the way I see cemeteries. They aren't just quiet places for the dead. They hold the living too, the desperate, the strange, the ones who slip through the cracks of society. And sometimes what you find there in the dark isn't something out of a story. It's something real, something you'll never quite forget, no matter how much time passes. I grew up in a small town where nothing much ever happened. Everyone knew each other, and nights were usually quiet unless there was a football game or someone threw a house party. When we were teenagers, we didn't have many options for hanging out. There were no movie theaters close by, no malls, no arcades. If we wanted to get out of the house, we either gathered in somebody's garage, sat around a bonfire in a field, or drove out onto the backroads to drink and talk. That was our version of nightlife. The backroads were endless out there. Narrow, winding, and surrounded by woods and fields. Sometimes it felt like they stretched forever without hitting a main road. The one spot we always came back to was a little cemetery a few miles out of town. It wasn't one of those big cemeteries with gates and marble headstones, just a small patch of land with maybe 30 or 40 graves, some so old you couldn't read the names anymore. There was no fence around it, just a dirt pull-off on the side of the road where you could leave your car. The cemetery itself sat on a slight rise, and not far from it was a small one-lane bridge that crossed a shallow creek. The bridge wasn't anything special, just 100 feet of asphalt, a dip in the road, and then the climb back up. The creek below was usually only a trickle unless it had rained hard. Then it swelled and moved quick, carrying branches and mud. The whole place had an eerie kind of feel at night. I couldn't tell if it was the cemetery, the bridge, or just the fact that it was so far from town. Out there, the silence pressed in hard, broken only by the occasional car that might pass through once an hour, maybe less. That night, there were 4 of us. We parked near the cemetery and walked over to the bridge with our drinks. The air was cool, and the moon wasn't out, so everything was darker than usual. The road dipped into blackness, and the creek below smelled faintly of wet earth and leaves. From the bridge, you could see the state highway off in the distance. The railroad tracks ran right alongside it, so whenever a car turned off the highway onto the road that led toward us, we'd catch the flash of headlights bouncing as it jumped the tracks. That gave us plenty of warning to move off the bridge before anyone came. We liked it because it felt like we had the place to ourselves. We'd already seen one set of headlights earlier, moved off the bridge, and let the car pass. Nothing unusual about that. Afterward, we went right back to leaning against the railings, talking and joking. The sound of the creek below mixed with the occasional croak of frogs. The kind of noise you don't notice until you stop talking. After a while, we saw another set of headlights flash as a car came off the highway. We all glanced at it, made a mental note, and kept talking. We figured we had a couple of minutes before it reached us. Sometimes, like I said, a car would turn down a road towards some houses before getting to the bridge, and in those cases we never even had to move. That's what we thought might have happened this time. But then it got strange. We kept talking, distracted, not paying full attention, until one of us realized we hadn't heard the car at all. No engine, no tires, nothing. More than enough time had passed for it to be on us or to have turned, but there was nothing. No light, no sound. I turned toward the highway, expecting to see headlights coming down the straight stretch, but it was pitch black. That sinking feeling hit my stomach right then. At the same time, we all turned around toward the far end of the bridge. And that's when we saw it, the red glow of taillights climbing the road on the other side. A car moving away from us. As soon as we saw it, we heard it, the sound of an engine, faint at first, then fading as it got farther. We stood frozen, staring. None of it made sense. There were no side roads between the highway and the bridge. No driveways, no cutoffs, nothing but ditches and trees. We all knew that. Yet somehow, the car had been behind us, going the opposite direction, without us ever hearing it come across the bridge. We tried to explain it right there on the spot. Maybe we'd been too wrapped up in our conversation and somehow missed it. Maybe it had been moving slower than we thought. But the more we went over it, the less it added up. That car should have passed us head-on. We should have seen the headlights on the dip, heard the tires over the bridge. Instead, the first time we saw it was the back end disappearing up the road away from us. Even after we left that night, we couldn't let it go. We checked again the next day in daylight, walking the length of the bridge and the road. There was nowhere for a car to come from or disappear to. Just a single narrow road, a creek underneath, and ditches on either side. The nearest driveway was miles up the road. That wasn't the only strange thing about that spot either. A few nights later, I went back with my girlfriend. We parked by the cemetery, not drinking this time, just sitting and talking. The night was still, no moon, no headlights anywhere. At one point, we both looked toward the tree-line that edged the cemetery. That's when we saw them, two faint red points, level with each other like eyes. At first, I thought it was just an animal. Out there you'd get raccoons, deer, coyotes sometimes. If you shine a flashlight, their eyes reflect back. But this was different. We didn't have any light shining into the trees, and the moon wasn't bright enough to cast a reflection. Yet the eyes stayed there, steady, glowing faintly. We kept staring, waiting for them to blink or move, but they didn't. Minutes passed, and the longer they stayed, the more uneasy I felt. Finally, they just vanished, like they'd never been there. The next day we went back in daylight to check. We walked down to the tree-line, searching for anything, a reflector, some kind of trash, something shiny that could explain it. But there was nothing, just trees and brush. Over the years, we kept going back to that bridge. Sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. We never saw the red eyes again, but we always remembered that night. As for the car, we never figured it out. No matter how many times we replayed it, the pieces didn't fit. A car we never saw coming, tail lights climbing away, sound that only appeared after we'd already seen it. In the end, that's all it was, confusion that never cleared. No ghosts, no stories passed down, just something that didn't make sense. We didn't lose hours of time or anything dramatic like that. Maybe it was only a couple of minutes, but it was enough to leave a mark. Enough to make me remember every detail of that night, even years later. And maybe that's the scariest part of it all. Not that something impossible happened, but that it might have been possible, and we just couldn't explain it. A car that was there and not there, eyes in the woods that shouldn't have glowed. Out on those back roads, far from anyone else, things didn't always add up the way they should. And once you notice, you never stop thinking about it. I've been to more cemeteries than most people my age. It wasn't out of morbid curiosity or anything like that. My parents just always seemed to enjoy walking through them, reading the names on the stones, the dates, the little phrases people left behind. They thought of it as peaceful, a way to step back in time and pay quiet respect to lives that had already run their course. So I grew up tagging along, not really questioning it. Over time, I got used to the atmosphere. For me, cemeteries became less about fear or superstition and more about quiet walks and a sort of strange, detached comfort. Some were well kept, perfectly mowed grass, flowers neatly placed. Others were older, some forgotten, with tilted stones and faded writing you had to squint at to make out. I never minded. There was only one cemetery I'd been to that I'd actually call creepy. It was abandoned and derelict, with vines curling around broken markers and whole sections where you couldn't even tell if someone was buried there anymore. But that one was an exception. Most of the time, I never felt unsafe. There was one cemetery in particular that stood out to me. It was close to my dormitory when I was in school, so I walked through it often. Sometimes I cut across it to save time, other times I went just to take photos for projects. I can still picture it clearly. The path that wound between the sections, the trees that swayed a little in the wind, the way the stones lined up so evenly in some places and leaned at odd angles in others. For some reason, it felt welcoming. The weather always seemed to be good when I was there, too, blue sky, just enough of a breeze to keep the air moving. I'd enter through the gate and feel a strange comfort settle over me, like stepping into a space where the noise of the world didn't reach as much. One particular day sticks in my head. The sun was shining, warm but not hot, and as soon as I stepped inside the gate, I felt calm in a way I couldn't explain. A hawk circled overhead, cutting across the sky, and I remember watching it for a long moment before it disappeared beyond the trees. It should have been eerie, but it wasn't. I don't know why. The cemetery wasn't anything extraordinary, but the calmness of that day, the warmth of the sun, and the breeze moving across the grass made it one of those moments that etches itself into memory for no reason you can point to. Not all my visits were like that, though. Some carried a different tone. One in particular happened around Halloween. My parents had taken me and a friend to a nearby cemetery. This one was bigger, with winding lanes and older stones, some so weathered the names had almost faded. The air was cooler, damp from rain earlier in the day, and the ground gave slightly underfoot as we walked. The sky was already dimming, and the flashlight beams cut across the uneven rows of stones. Walking in cemeteries at night is a different thing entirely. In the daytime, there's sunlight, birds, sounds of cars or people far off. At night, everything feels closer, more enclosed. Every sound, a twig breaking, a branch creaking, stands out. The beams of the flashlights only light up narrow cones, leaving everything beyond in shadow. We were picking our way carefully along the path when one of the flashlights flickered and went out. I remember the beam sputtering against a row of stones before the light completely disappeared. My mom muttered something under her breath and took a careful step, and then she stumbled forward hard enough that I heard the scrape of her shoe against the stone. She caught herself before she fell, but when we shined the other flashlight down, it lit up the ground in front of her. It wasn't a raised stone she had tripped over. It wasn't one of the big markers sticking up out of the earth. It was a flat stone, set flush into the ground. Just a simple rectangle of granite pressed even with the soil and grass. And when my friend leaned in to read it, the name staring back at us was one that made my stomach tighten. It was their family name. Not some distant stranger, but their own relative. I saw the way their face changed when they realized it. Their expression shifted from the cautious look we'd all been wearing to something heavier, something personal. The odds of that happening, of all the places my mom could have stumbled, all the stones she could have tripped over in that cemetery, it ended up being one tied directly to the person walking beside us. Felt strange in a way that stuck with me. It wasn't supernatural. It was chance. But standing there with the cold air brushing against my skin, I couldn't shake the chill of it. We stood a moment longer before continuing, the flashlight beams moving ahead again, a little shakier than before. The rest of the walk didn't last long. We didn't talk much, and we didn't linger. It felt like the place had already given us its message. Looking back on it now, I know there was nothing unexplainable in what happened. A flashlight died, my mom's shoe caught on the edge of a stone, and it turned out to be one with a name that mattered to my friend. All simple things on their own, but it's the way they lined up together in that setting that left the impression. Sometimes the strangest feelings come not from what can't be explained, but from what can. I still think about both of those cemeteries sometimes, the one near my dorm, where I felt inexplicably calm, and the one on Halloween, where chance played out in a way that felt heavier than it should have. They're just places, just land with stones and grass. But the way we move through them, the things that happen while we're there, they stick with us. They stay in memory longer than other ordinary walks ever could. And that's the part that unsettles me most. Not ghosts, not shadows, not stories told in whispers, but the real moments, the ones that remind you that cemeteries are filled with connections. Some are obvious, some are unexpected, and sometimes they find their way to you in ways you couldn't predict. That's why even now, when I walk past a cemetery, I don't just see markers in the ground. I think about how those places carry weight, how every step through them can land on something you didn't expect. And sometimes those steps follow you long after you've left.